let's get started with our next talk from Mark Morowczynski, Michael Epping. Sorry if I butchered your names. I owe you guys a beer. So let's get started with hiding in the clouds, how attackers can use applications for sustained persistence, and how to find them.
So Michael's going to be driving the slides and some of the demos, and I'm going to do my best to watch the chat as well as watch the Discord. So if anyone has any questions, they can post it there, and I'll try to keep an eye on it. Michael, you all set?
Yep, good to go.
Okay, cool. So hi, everybody. So welcome to Hiding in the Clouds, how attackers can use applications for sustained persistence and how to find it. I am Mark Morowczynski. I'm here with Michael Epping, and we are program managers in the identity division at Microsoft. So we are responsible for Active Directory, Active Directory Federation Services, and Azure Active Directory. So you can go to the next slide there, Michael. So we work on a team that is working with customers on their deployments of Azure Active Directory, and we take those learnings and the feedback from those deployments and we work it back into the product to make it easier and better for everybody else. So if you have Office 365, I know people in BSides sometimes don't spend a lot of time in the identity space like Michael and I do. If you have Office 365, you have Azure Active Directory. So Michael and I have worked with a lot of customers on this issue, so I think we have some good stuff here we're going to share. So what we're first going to cover here is what is application consent and why you should care about it if you aren't already. And then I'm going to talk about what are some of those key permissions you should be looking for. And then Michael's going to go into how to find some of the stuff in your environment. And then lastly, we're going to cover some best practices and things you can go do. So there's a lot of stuff in this talk. We're going to make the slides available at the very end. And hopefully we have lots of good things you can go back and do in your environment to protect yourself. So, okay, why should you care about applications if you haven't been doing so already? So on average, an organization will have 140 apps, but this can be a number that varies greatly depending on the size of your organization. So some of the customers that Michael and I work with are extremely large, and it's not uncommon for them to have thousands and thousands and thousands of applications. One of the customers I'm working with is modernizing their applications to move to Azure AD as their identity provider, and they think it's going to take them from anywhere from 7 to 9 years to move all their applications to modern authentication. So 140 is just kind of like a low number, but you probably know better than anyone how many applications you have in your environment. And 87% of users today can consent to applications. And the act of consenting to an application, which we'll get into here shortly, isn't necessarily bad or malicious, but there is some things that allows an application to do in your environment, which you may or may not want them to do as blue teamers, right? So Michael and I are really all about this blue team defense, and there's a lot of good stuff in here that you may not be aware of, but you need to as those architects, those security folks, and those blue team defenders, that just because you consent to an application means an application can do stuff, and you may or may not want that depending on your environment and your organization and your business model and risk tolerance and things like that. And then 80% of employees are using non-approved apps from work. You've probably heard this before. This is the shadow IT type of thing where, and again, doesn't mean that they're malicious. It could be just like, we want people to use Box or OneDrive, and this business unit is using Dropbox because that's the link that they got, and they didn't know any better. And now we have application, corporate data on these different things that they shouldn't be. So if you haven't started to look at your applications and data, you really, really should. So let's talk about what we mean by when we say application consent. So you're probably pretty familiar with this on your mobile phone, right? So you add an application to your phone from the App Store or wherever, and it says it's asking for a bunch of permissions that it wants to be able to do. So it wants to be able to maybe access your camera because it's going to take your picture and you can then modify it and put funny faces or whatever you're going to do on it. And it also wants it access to your photo library so you can edit past photos. And it also wants access to your contacts so that way you can send that funny photo directly from this application to your coworkers or friends and family and things like that. So the application consent model in Azure AD and most clouds apps. So Michael and I are going to talk about Azure AD perspective, but this applies to any OAuth or OpenID Connect applications as well. So it's not specific to Azure AD, but this is what we're going to talk from our point of view. So this consent model of application consent and permissions is a very, very similar model in Azure Active Directory. So we have an application, and it's going to want to have access to organizational data, And that organizational data is going to be exposed via resource APIs. And there's different permission levels for those APIs. And we're going to get into all this here in a little bit. And those permissions can be granted through the process called application consent. And we have two different types of consent. We have admin consent and we have end user consent. But let's talk about some of these different terms. So this is kind of like a high level thing, but let's kind of dig in to align ourselves to that OpenID OAuth type of spec. So the first thing here is we have a term called a client application. This is going to be it could be a mobile app, it could be a web app, it could be an application that's running in the background that's going to be requesting that data on behalf of that user. And then we have the resource application, which is going to be usually a web API that exposes this data or functionality. In our case here, at Azure AD, it's going to be called the Microsoft graph. And then we have permissions, which is what the client application is asking to be able to perform on that data owned by that resource. So here we have a screenshot of this, and you may have seen this in your environment where we have an application here called Contoso Test App. And this application wants to be able to read users and shared contacts, their calendars, and sign in and read their profile. And this is going through the Microsoft graph. So another example is like OneDrive. Some application wants to read the user's OneDrive files all through the Microsoft graph. So this is kind of the dialog box that you'll see here as an admin or an end user. And Michael's going to show you a demo of this here in a little bit to kind of go over, walk you through this if you've never seen this before. But let's talk about some consent terminology. So that dialog box that we just showed you is called the consent prompt. And then we have the act of saying yes is called the consent grant. So it's pretty straightforward. Now here is where we differ a little bit from that phone type of model that you may or may not be used to. I'm guessing here everyone is probably used to that model. So the process of administrative consent is when someone with administrative permissions is going to be granting access to an application. And we do this because of two different reasons. The first reason is the application may be asking for permissions that are highly privileged. And we don't want end users to have the ability to say that's okay because they don't maybe understand what's being asked. They don't understand what the risk is to the business. They shouldn't be able to do this. So maybe the application is asking for the ability to read and write to all mailboxes. And maybe that reason is because it's an e-discovery app, right? We don't want end users to be able to say like, that's okay. That's quite a bit of permissions. An admin will have to go in there and say that this is a very privileged operation. An admin's going to have to say it's okay before we can add that to our directory. The other reason why you'd want to do this as an administrator is because when an administrator does a consent grant for an application, they're actually consenting to this for all of the users in their directory. So then users will not see the consent dialog box when they go to use that application as an end user. So the best example I can think about this for is the native mail client in iOS. So if you're going to use it with Exchange Online, a user opens up the mail app, they put their username and password in, they do the whole authentication flow, and then the application prompts them for that consent grant experience. And it wants to be able to like read to their mailbox, write to their mailbox, some basic stuff, right? Just whatever it can do. And the user can say, yes, I can do that. And then they go ahead and click through. And now the native mail app on their iOS device now gets mail. But we could say as administrators or defenders, we can say, you know what, we trust this application and we're okay if people use that. And we want to improve that end user experience. We're going to go in there as administrators and do an administrative consent for this application. Now, the next person that goes to use that native mail app for the first time, they will not have to consent to the application because as administrators, we've already done that consent. Okay, so there's two different types of permissions that we're going to consent grant applications can have when we consent to that. The first one here is what we want most applications to be using, which is the delegated permissions model. And this requires for an application to work, the user must be signed in and present for the application to make calls on behalf of that user. So this is what most end users can consent to. And if it's a higher privileged permission, this is what requires an admin to get involved to consent to this application. Now, this is where people tend to get a little tripped up because of the effective permissions model of this delegated permissions. This is the intersection of the user's underlying permissions and what the application can be granted to. So what do I mean by that? Let's say this application is the best search application ever, right? It's the best thing ever for searching SharePoint sites, and it's asking for the ability to read all SharePoint sites. So user consents to this. Let's say it has the permissions to do this. They consent to that application, or they're going to use that application. They are not getting the ability to search all of SharePoint. The effective model is the intersection of the application and that user. So if the user only has the ability to read certain SharePoint sites, when they're using that application, they too only have the ability to use that search on the SharePoint sites that they have. So what I'm trying to say is you're not granting people more permissions than they normally would have using the delegated permission model. It's still what the user has and what the application is able to do. Now, this is sometimes called scopes, OAuth 2 permission grants, or app plus user permissions. And we really, really want to use applications to have the delegated permission model. Now, the second type of permission model is called application permissions. And these are used by apps without anyone being signed in or present. So these can run fully in the background, no user required. And whatever permissions that you grant to an application in application permission model, that is the permissions that the application has the ability to do. So if there's some application that is asking for the ability to do directory read write all, that application has the ability to do directory read write all. There is no intersection. Like whatever we grant to this, it can do. So these are extremely powerful permissions that we want to make sure we understand why applications need those permissions and why it has to have this permission model. We really, really want to use that delegated permission model because we have the intersection. Application permissions are also always required admin to consent to. End users cannot consent to this. And this is sometimes called roles, app roles, or app only permissions. Okay, so we have this nice slide here that kind of is a summary of everything I just talked about in those previous two slides. So just to kind of recap, because this is kind of a lot of information if you've never looked at this before, we have two types of permissions. We have delegated and application permissions. And that delegated model is going to be for those mobile apps, those web apps, or those SPA, single page applications. And users can grant or can consent to this, or admins can consent to this for all users in the organization. And this requires a user to be signed in and present. And that effective permission model is the combination of what the end user has as well as what the application has. The application permission model is when it runs as a service and only can be consented to by the administrator. And whatever permissions we grant, that is what that application has the ability to do. So they're very, very powerful. So we want applications to use that delegated permissions, not application permissions if we can help it. And with that, Michael's going to show you a quick demo of this consent framework.
Yep, so I'm going to switch over here to my browser. So what I'm going to show here first is I'm a standard end user. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to an application that has an SSO experience with Office 365. So this application's never been created in my directory before. I'm a normal end user. I want to sign in with my Office 365 account. But in my tenant, my normal end users are not allowed to consent to permissions on behalf of themselves. So what you see here is kind of the standard consent experience where it shows like what permissions it's asking for. We can see that it's asking for some permissions to read the user's groups, to read the user's profile, a couple other types of permissions. But the user doesn't have the ability to actually go and consent to this for themselves. There's also a feature where you can have a workflow where the user can enter a justification, say like, I need this for work, and click request approval, and this will send a notification to your administrators, and then the administrators can go and decide if they want to grant that access. But out of the box, this feature is not turned on. So typically your users are going to kind of run into a brick wall here, and maybe they need to open a help desk ticket, or maybe they just never actually get to use that application. In this case, I have the feature turned on, so I'll click the request button, and that's going to generate a request, send it to my administrators. But at this point, I don't get access to the application. So over on my administrator side, if I go over to the admin consent area, we should see that that request came in. So we can see that there's this app that's being requested, who's requesting it. But really what I want to show is what does the experience look like when an administrator actually decides that they are going to go do the admin consent. So I'm a global administrator in this browser window. So I'm going to go in here and specify which account I'm signing in with. And here I am able to see the same permissions. So it's roughly the same experience. But I have this new checkbox because I'm a global administrator that's consent on behalf of your organization. So like Mark talked about, basically what this is going to do is it's going to codify this app as something that's allowed, or my end users are allowed to use in our environment. So any subsequent end users who come to use this application, they're not going to see the consent screen. They'll be able to just sign right in because this is an approved app, just like that iOS mail app use case. So in this case, I'm going to hit accept, and the admin consent at this point should be complete, and users no longer will see the consent screen.
All right. So yes, that's, if you've never seen consent before, that's the consent experience. So let's talk about what happens when you click consent. But before we get to that, Bill made a comment that Microsoft is using a Mac laughing face. So good eye, Bill. So there's a few people on our team that use Mac laptops. Michael and I happen to be both of them. And we have lots of customers that actually have Macs in their environment, and we do a lot of stuff with them to help improve the Mac experience as well, from a identity side. So I actually just posted in the chat, we have this new Apple SSO plugin that will help cut down on the prompts you're getting on those iOS and Mac devices. So I just pasted that chat in there. And if you have any questions about Azure AD in general, or Mac on Azure AD in general, Michael and I are both very able to answer those questions. You can post into Discord, and we're happy to answer those after this talk as well. Okay, so we click consent. What actually happens under the hood? So the first thing is, in Azure AD, there's two parts. There's an application registrations and there's enterprise apps. And we're doing some work to kind of make this a little bit easier for you. But hold on, go back, Michael. We got a lot to go through. So what actually happens? Okay, so the application registration is the definition of an application. You can think of this as like, this is the back of the house configuration of the application. So this is like, is this application going to be a single tenant application, like only for us? Is this going to be an application that's a multi-tenant application? Is it going to be able to use Azure AD credentials? Do you want it to be able to use Azure AD credentials and Microsoft accounts? So that's all going to be part of the definition of the application itself, which is only going to live in one tenant. And then in the enterprise apps is where you're going to have the service principals. And this is the representation of that application in the tenant. So you can think of the enterprise apps area as the front of the house. So this is where you can apply like conditional access policies to the application to say, in order to actually get to this application, you need to do MFA, you need to come from an or a device that's either Intune managed or all kinds of stuff like that. So that's all going to be in the enterprise app space. So to give you an example of this, let's say Michael and I are working on a timekeeping application. So in our tenant 1, we're going to have an app registration of the timekeeping application. And then we also use that application to keep track of our time on the projects that we work on. So we're going to have that service principal in the enterprise apps of our tenant. And then we sell this application to other companies so they can do timekeeping as well. So in tenant 2, tenant 3, tenant N, they will have a service principal in their enterprise app of this application. They will not see anything in app registrations for this app specifically. So if you go look in your Azure AD directory, you will find enterprise apps for things like Exchange Online, Salesforce, Workday, things of that nature. You will not see anything in app registrations. But let's say you are moving your line of business application. So there's an application that you made just for your tenant, or maybe it's an application that you're selling to other companies. You'll see that app in the app registrations as well as seeing it in enterprise apps. So this is confusing. Let us know in the chat. We're happy to talk a little bit more and help in Discord. But this should hopefully explain why when you look at your tenant, you don't see those Salesforce and Exchange Online and SharePoint, things like that in your app registrations. You only see that in your enterprise apps. Okay, so service principals are really, really important because applications can be authorized to access data. You can go to the next slide, Michael. So a service principal in this model is a security principal. So service principals can be granted access to things. So we already covered the two ones you're probably thinking of, which is that app-only permissions as well as the delegated permission grants. But service principals can also be on Azure Key Vault ACLs. Service principals can hold role assignments in Azure. Service principals can hold directory role assignments in the directory, and service principals can be owners of things like groups, application, and other service principals. So service principals are very, very powerful things. We want to make sure we have a good understanding of what applications have been consented to in our environment and what are those permissions, because they can do lots and lots of things in their environment. So you can go to the next slide. So I know somebody here right now is probably thinking just like Grandpa Simpson, and they're like, I know that the cloud was a problem from the start, and now I have all these applications in my tenant, and I don't understand how any of them got there because people have been assigned to them. I don't know who got assigned to them, so I have like some people can access applications, some people can't, and I have all these permissions that can do things in my directory, and I have no idea how this happened. Like, I know this is the cloud's fault, and we should have never done the cloud to begin with. And it's not as bad as it seems. We have some stuff we'll give you that will help make this easier, and there's some knobs you can turn that will make this easier as well. But I dare you to ask the same questions about your on-prem apps as well. It's actually usually for most customers, it's worse because there isn't this central place where applications are coming through. It's worse because we don't know who's accessing what applications. It's worse because we actually don't know what permissions those applications have asked for. An application may have asked for something like domain admin, and what permissions is it using? Can you even tell? You don't know. So things like that. So it's actually probably going to be worse on-prem, but in the cloud, we have some stuff that's going to help you with this. So why are we talking a lot about this and all this? Because we're talking about all this stuff about these applications. Like, why should you care about any of these things that we just said? Let's get into the malware part of this, as well as that sustained persistence. So typical malware campaigns have been right where we have the subject is we're trying to get you to, entice you to open this mail. We have some sort of like attachment, and we want you to run this because we can run that macro in our environment. And, we got that spoof stuff. And now we're starting to see those COVID-19 theme campaigns. So these people are trying to impersonate the CDC. They're trying to prey on people's fear. And again, we still want they want you to run that Word document, that attachment, so they can run that macro. And they're trying to take advantage of people's fear with COVID-19. So this is what they've been doing. But what we're starting to see people move to is, instead of this traditional phishing where we want you to try to run a macro, they're trying to get you to consent to a malicious application, which this has a few different things that we want to make sure we think about. But this is kind of an example we've seen, right? So this COVID-19 bonus attachment, go ahead and click on that. And now we have this application consent grant that we've seen for other things. And this application is called Office 365 Access. That logo looks a little bit kind of okay, but looks a little odd to me. And let's look, it's asking for some stuff, read my profile, read my contacts. And then if you start looking through these consent prompts, it wants to be able to also read your mail. It wants to be able to read all my notebooks, and it wants to be able to read and write to my mailbox settings, which can have all kinds of access, right? And it's quite a bit of permissions. And if a user clicks on this, remember that this is a delegated permission request. It has the same ability for these permissions and what that end user has the ability to do. So this end user has the ability to update their mailbox rules and change forwarding rules. Like, that's something that end users have the ability to do and need to do. And now this application has this ability to do this as well. And this is where that sustained persistence comes into the mix. Because if you click accept to this, if the end user clicks accept, and we're not doing any of the other proper stuff we'll get to here shortly, this application has the ability to do that. So let's say you find this application is bad and malicious, and you go there and you remove it and you delete it. Great. It doesn't remove the persistent mechanisms that it did. So if it added a mailbox forwarding rule to say anytime mail comes in with payment or whatever, send it to this external domain, it doesn't clean those rules up. So from a sustained persistence model, just because they got you to click on this application and you remove the application, you still need to remove those existing things that made changes to in your environment. And this gets even worse if it's from an application that has admin permissions, because permissions that you can grant to as an admin can be equivalent to just like an admin account. So let's say an attacker got a hold of an admin account and they knew they were only going to have access to this account for 5, 10, 15 minutes. And they went in and they granted consent to an application that has the ability to do things like directory read write all, and then they lost access to that account. That application basically has the same permissions as an admin. So it can be very, very powerful in your environment. So you want to look for this. Okay, so what are those key permissions you should be looking for in your applications? So anything that's like a star, mail.star, mailbox settings star, contacts people, file star, anything that's that, directory read write all, that type of stuff. Anytime you have read write all, you really want to make sure we understand what those permissions are used for. Now, just because an application is asking for the ability to read all mail, or maybe do like some of these permissions, membership, read hidden, things like that, doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it has a lot of permissions. And something like I talked about earlier, which is like an e-discovery app, it's probably going to need the ability to read and write to all of the mailboxes. Maybe if it's a governance tool, it's going to need to be able to read those hidden group memberships. It's going to have a lot of permission. So just because an application is asking for these types of permissions doesn't mean it's malicious. It just means it has a lot of power. And we want to make sure we understand exactly why the application needs these types of permissions, because usually it doesn't. And people just don't know. We'll get into that a little bit here shortly. But these are really, really key permissions to look for. We want to make sure if you have any applications in your environment that have these permissions, you as defenders really, really want to understand why does it have those permissions and does it really need that? Okay, some other lower level permissions that I want everybody to think about is user.read, OpenID, email, and profile. These are like very, very basic permissions that are considered low impact that people can just go ahead and use. But the question you have to ask is, are you okay with end users consenting to these applications to begin with? So the example I have for you is we had a customer that some end user wanted to use like a directory application or whatever, and it asked for these permissions and basically like wants to read the gal, right? Any end user can read the gal, wants to read the gal. User clicked yes, the end user had those permissions. It uses that delegated permission model. The application read the gal. And about 6 months later, one of their executives was using that same directory application, and they were very, very surprised to see their first name, their last name, their email address, and their gal profile picture was on this directory site. And what was the reaction? We've been hacked. We've been hacked. Our data's been pushed to this site. What's going on here? They haven't been hacked, right? This is just basic information that end users have the ability to do. They can read the gal. They need to be able to do that. But you as an organization from a risk perspective need to make those decisions are, even though the permission impact here is low, this is just basic stuff end users can look at. Do you want them to be able to consent to this type of information? Because you may not want them to be able to do that because people don't understand the impact. And with that, Michael's going to show you a demo here to kind of really hammer home what applications can do in your environment from a permission perspective.
Okay, so just from a getting started standpoint, one of the things you can do in the Azure AD portal is actually go and look at the permissions that have been assigned on your applications and check and see if they've been admin consented. So looking at this application that we have in one of these lab tenants, we already can see that this thing has some suspicious stuff going on. You can see that it's kind of got a misspelling in it, so that's probably not good. So this might be something that is concerning. And if we start looking at the permissions, there's a couple things we notice. There's a lot of permissions that have read, write, all. So there's a lot of write permissions in here, including directory read, write, all, which is very dangerous. This is kind of like being a global admin in the application. And then if we look at the type of permissions, again, we're seeing those application permissions. So delegated are the ones that we want to try to use. If we're giving application permissions, these are very broad permissions. So for example, mailbox settings.read-write basically gives the application the ability to set things like rules, like mailbox rules on any mailbox in the tenant. So let's take a look at what that looks like if I'm an application. So going over here, I actually set up a demo app in my lab that has that setting, mailbox settings.read-write as an app permission. So this app that I'm going to demo with has the ability to go touch any mailbox and set mail forwarding rules on it, essentially. So, you know, we're not 100% sure how the setting got put in. Maybe an administrator got tricked. Maybe an admin consented to this because they didn't really know what they were doing, or something happened where this app got an application mailbox setting.read-write permission. So not ideal. So if we pop open Postman, I'm going to pretend to be the application here. So what I'm going to do here first is get an access token. So what I've just done is I've gotten an access token in the context of the application. No user signed in. There's no user interaction, no administrator interaction. I'm going to take this access token, and in the context of the application, I'm going to create a mail forwarding rule. So I've got a user here. So same demo user I've been using, so Luke at michaelepping.com. And I'm going to make a call to Microsoft Graph API to set a forwarding rule on his inbox. So again, no user interaction here. Like Luke's never signed in. Nobody signed into this thing. This application just has permission to do this. So I run the Graph API command, and it's done. There's a mail forwarding rule. So what does this look like from an end user perspective? So if I go back to Luke and go to his mailbox, view Outlook settings and rules, we can see that there's a mail forwarding rule here. I can set any parameters on this I want. I can make it look sort of official, try to encourage the end user not to modify this, make it look really legitimate. But if I go back to Postman and I look at the actual contents of the rule, we can see here that it's forwarding to my Gmail address, and I just use help desk as a placeholder. So essentially what we have here is an application that has permissions to modify mailbox rules on a user account with no human interaction. So once the permission is given, this application can do this at any time to any mailbox. So even if I delete this application, this mail forwarding rule that's being used for data exfiltration is not going away. Okay. So let me just fire my slides back up. So how do we actually investigate these illicit consent grants? So we have these in our environment already, but we need to actually go discover them. So at this point, like maybe an administrator in your tenant has already consented to something, maybe it already exists. What do we do about it? So there are multiple ways to investigate this. Some that are like really easy to do in a one-off scenario. But if you have a lot of applications in your tenant, like hundreds or potentially thousands in the case of a really large Azure AD tenant, we need something a little more automated. But the first thing is you can use the Office 365 portal. There's an audit log tool in the Office 365 portal that you can use to look for all sorts of things. You can look for applications getting added to the directory, consents being done. You can use the Security and Compliance Center audit logs to look for admin consent actions, any actions taken by your global administrators. It's very powerful. So there's a lot you can do there. In the Azure AD portal, like I showed you, there's an enterprise apps section where you can go and look at the permissions that are on any of the applications in your directory. There's also audit logs in Azure AD. Azure AD retains audit logs for 30 days, but there's ways to export these to like SimTools, Splunk, whatever. So you can keep them for longer to do investigations past the 30-day mark. But then if we want to actually investigate what exists at the point in time, we've written a PowerShell script. So basically what this PowerShell script allows you to do, and I'll demo it in a little bit, but what it allows you to do is actually pull a list of all the permissions that are in your directory currently and export them to an Excel file and parse through it. You can do pivot tables, any sort of data analysis that's available in Excel, and really comb through this. And hopefully what the Excel file also helps you do is prioritize. And then finally, there's CASB solutions as well. So at Microsoft, we have Microsoft Cloud App Security, which is our CASB product. There's other ones out there on the market, but these also allow you to investigate. So with Microsoft Cloud App Security, you can create policies to investigate risky app consents and even revoke or block them. So start with high-risk users and apps that have lots of users assigned to them. The reason for this is in really, really large tenants, you may have a ton of applications and you want to prioritize like what's most risky. So Mark showed the slide earlier where he outlined like permissions that we say are relatively high risk. Ideally, you'd investigate everything, but sometimes there's a lot going on in an environment and you want to start with what's most high risk. So in the script and the Excel output, we've tried to help you do this prioritization so that you have a list of applications that have lots of users assigned to them. They have riskier permissions, they have application permissions, like all the red flags we're kind of looking for. So in the Excel file, you'll see there's a high risk users tab and also a high risk apps tab. Definitely use these and start with those applications, but don't stop there. Like you really want to get a handle on this for your entire environment. And you want to look for write permissions. That's one of the other things to keep in mind is Read permissions can be dangerous, but the write permissions are like really, really dangerous. You want to look for things like applications that have write permissions or delegated write permissions that have a lot of power over a user, like things like modifying the user's mailbox and things like that. Okay, so let's take a look at the Excel file. So this is just an export from my lab tenant. But basically what this Excel file consists of is a big bucket of data about every consent grant that exists in the tenant. And then we have a few tabs that we auto-generate that have pivot tables and pivot charts on them. And we've done some classification for you so that you can see what applications are considered to have low-risk permissions, how many have delegated permissions to all principals. So this is an admin consent. And then how many have individual user consents, and then how many have application permissions. So for example, there's some graph API permissions that have been granted to all users in this tenant and some application permissions. These are things we probably want to look into. If you're better at pivot tables than I am when I wrote the script, all the raw data is there so you can do any of your own analysis, but hopefully this is something to help you get started. So like I mentioned, we also have these high-risk user and high-risk apps tabs. So there's some logic built into the script to basically look for users who have lots of permissions, lots of consent grants in the environment, and then flag them so that you can investigate these users, and help you prioritize. In this environment, I don't have a ton of users, but there could be a bunch in here at different risk levels, like medium, low. But really, like the high-risk users are the place to start. And then probably even more important is high-risk applications. So again, those applications that have lots of users assigned. So if you see this all users thing, again, this means that there was an admin consent done, which means that any user in your tenant can access this application and use any of the effective permissions that that app has. Or the application has some application permissions, so it can act without a user signed in at all. And then for other applications, there may be a subset of your users who are allowed to sign into that application. So we just have a nice descending table to hopefully make it easier to prioritize. Okay. So some other indicators of compromise to look for. Apps trying to blend in. I've seen apps before that look like SharePoint, but they have like a 1 instead of the I. You saw in our lab tenant, we have Woodgroove instead of Woodgrove. Apps will try to blend in. They'll try to look like a legitimate application. They'll try to look like OneDrive. They'll try to look like SharePoint. They'll even use like very similar logos, all sorts of stuff like that. So keep an eye out for things like that. Keep an eye out for suspicious activity. Like if you're analyzing your sign-in logs for your applications, look for things like users signing in at odd times of the day, users signing in from odd locations. You know your environment, and you should really know like what the typical usage pattern in your environment is, and then be able to flag things that fall outside that usage pattern. So deviation from the user's normal behavior. Is the user logging into all sorts of applications that they really shouldn't be? Like, do you have a user in finance who's doing lots of stuff with Graph API? That might be like a little unusual. Are they accessing like Azure AD PowerShell? That might be a little unusual. So you know your users, you know what they're generally getting up to. Keep an eye out for users doing things that you normally wouldn't expect. And date and time of applications being created. So if you know that there was a compromise, look at your logs and see, was an application created in my tenant around that time or just previously to some sort of incident, and use that as part of your investigation. Look at who added the application, what permissions were granted to it, all those sorts of things. So you also need to determine the magnitude and scope of the attack. So one of the things that you can do, and this is a tip from Microsoft's Dart team, I believe. So, and that's one of our incident response teams. But basically what you can do is use the Office 365 content search or audit log and content search tool. And you can scope it to a specific service. So like if you have a breach, go in here, do an audit log search, see everything that a particular user was up to around the time of an incident, and scope it to a specific service if you're able. It makes the search tool execute much more quickly if you can scope down what you're looking for. And if you have a confirmation of an attack, start your incident response process. So does your incident response process cover app consent scenarios? So all the stuff we've been talking about, are these things factored into your incident response? So do you disable the malicious service principal? Are you revoking the OAuth consents that are done? There's PowerShell commands you can use to revoke the OAuth consents. Are you revoking the service app role assignment with PowerShell? Are you disabling sign-in for accounts that have accessed the application, or accounts that may have consented to the application or done an admin consent to the application? And are you then investigating persistence mechanisms? So if the application has the ability to modify mailbox settings, like I showed, maybe you need to look at, like, are there any weird mailbox rules on some of the mailboxes? You need to investigate what may have been done with the permissions that were granted to the illicitly consented application. Okay, back to you, Mark.
Yeah, so let's cover some best practices. But that big one there at the very end, Michael talked about, is removing the persistence is super, super key. Sometimes customers discover there's an app that's malicious, and then they're like, I dumped the memory, we ran everything on the box, we did timeline analysis, like it looks clean, and it's like, it's not on the box, right? It's in the service. So that's super, super important to realize. Okay. What are some best practices we can do for this? So the first one here is you can set policies. So any app consent policy that the user is going to get prompted with, you have 3 different choices, and it's a little hard to see depending on your bandwidth here. But the bottom there it goes. The bottom one is allow users to consent for any application. So any user can consent to any application permissions that delegated permissions. They can just consent to it. The top button is don't allow users to consent to anything. An admin has to go in and approve everything. The Goldilocks one is kind of this middle one, which is now the default, in which we recommend, but I've seen customers set to the bottom one, which is allow anyone to consent to anything because they didn't understand what was going on. And this is if there's a low permission, which you can define, which are those low impact permissions, and the application is from a verified publisher. So that's the application vendor has connected their tenant to their Microsoft partner network. So you get the little like blue checkbox in the app. If it's one of those, you can let people consent to it, which means like, hey, we trust this application. It's not some fly-by-night thing. We're okay with it. So you can set those, but pick a thing and make sure you set it so you understand what people can do in your environment to begin with. Then also, if you have cloud app security, you can go ahead and use this to automatically revoke any applications when app risk is detected. So that's the first thing you can do. The second thing is this step-up consent. So when risky consent is being asked for, the admin will have to go in and approve this. This is on by default. So somebody, Chris asked in the chat, is there a way for admins to be able to like review the configuration before actually going forward? This is exactly what this is. This is that middle ground you can do for that. And only administrators would be able to consent to an application if it's not one of those from a verified publisher, or if it's not one of those application permissions that's considered like low impact. The other thing here with this is an audit event will be logged as well. So this is really, really useful if you see somebody maybe clicked on an application that was considered risky and it showed up in the audit log, but they weren't able to consent to that. Maybe they just got a phishing email, right? And maybe they're getting other phishing emails, right? So just because a user wasn't able to consent to this application and is pending an admin, that is really good information for us as defenders to take a look at, because now maybe that domain is suspicious, maybe that email address itself is suspicious. We can maybe look at other people that have gotten that mail, right? So make sure you're looking at your audit log for these types of events. All right, next is how do we detect these applications? So those 2 configuration things we just talked about is going forward, right? This is what the new applications are going to get. Now, how do we look at what's already happened in our environment? So the first one there, Michael already walked us through this, which is that really, really nice script. I pasted the link in the chat, but you can get it here as well. And this dumps out all those permissions. You can look through them, do the pivot tables, all that kind of good stuff. That's a good place to start. The issue with that is you have to do it all the time, right? Like some admin has to go in and run this and look at this and then make a decision, and you have to keep doing it over and over again. A better thing you can do is using Azure Monitor or a SIEM tool of your choice where you're piping those audit logs to it and you take a look at it. But in Azure Monitor, you can automatically send notifications when an app is requiring high permissions, an app has been authorized by more than whatever amount. So let's say it's a good example there is that Apple Mail app, right? A bunch of people are consenting to that. They can. Let's take a look at that. That's something that we're okay with as an organization. Let's go ahead and do admin consent for everybody and improve our end user experience. You can do that with Azure Monitor. And then the best is something like a CASB solution. Michael kind of talked about that earlier. Microsoft's one is called MCAS, but it doesn't really matter. You can use whatever you want. And then again, it has stuff that's like apps authorized by external users, that high level stuff. You can revoke it when people are acting odd. So that's kind of like the best solution you can do is that MCAS. But the script is great to do. Script that, automate it yourself. Even better, use Azure Monitor or a SIEM to go through and look through that stuff. All right. Next thing here is start getting in front of this with your developers, which are going to be your internal developers, as well as the external vendors that you're probably working with. So we are adding new permissions all of the time to Microsoft Graph. So we want to make sure we're using least privilege, right? This is not a new problem. I'm sure everybody on this call here has had an application that the business unit bought, and they're like, please install this for us. And you look at this thing and it like wants enterprise admin, domain admin, and scheme admin. And you're like, what in the world is this thing doing? I thought this was just like sending mail or something, right? So developers are going to do this because they just don't know, right? They don't know what permissions they need. So they're going to be like, give me everything just in case, right? We don't want them to do that. So anytime you see directory star, that is not using least privilege, but I think everyone here probably knew that already. So we have some links here. If you go to ak.ms/graph best practices, as well as ak.ms/identity platform checklist, there's some good stuff here for your developers. Those that are using Teams has grown quite a bit in the last 6 months. Go to ak.ms/rsc-teams. There's lots of app-specific guidance for creating apps in Teams. But if you have another good thing to use here is if you go to ak.ms/identity developer series, it's about a 2.5-hour YouTube video that goes into how to do development with Azure AD. It covers like the libraries you should be using, which is you want to use the MSAL library. It covers this permission models. It covers some stuff from your developers. So you want to make sure your developers take a look at that. But you as defenders should also watch this. This is really go in depth in some of the stuff we talked about, as well as some other things we didn't even talk about, which is like the libraries and things like that people can be using. So go watch that. It's really, really helpful. But again, for your applications, you want to make sure they're using least privilege. And also when you have third-party ISV apps, they're going to be using sometimes those higher permission models. I've had several of my customers push back on some third parties and say, we're not granting you those permissions. That's way too much. Your app doesn't need that. You need to be using lower permissions. No different than when someone wants domain admin or enterprise admin. You push back. Same thing for this. Okay. Last thing here. If you see an application and it looks suspicious, you can report it through MCAS or this consent screen as well. So that checkbox right below for an admin there where it says, the thing's still coming through for me, but it says, does this app look suspicious? Report it here. You click on that. You can report those applications that you think are phishing or suspicious to us, and then we will go take a look at them and take action on them and remove them for everybody and things like that. So if you see something, please say something. All right. Got a few minutes left here. So what are our go-dos? So first, go back and a bare minimum, run that PowerShell script, look at your applications you have, go ahead and look for those dangerous permissions, look for those high privileged users, and set those the right types of risk-based step up for your things for going forward. So you can do that by default in the risk-based part. But those 3 radio buttons, the block everything, allow everything, or do the middle one. Go take a look at this. Make sure everyone agrees on what are those permission models we want to do, and make sure we're understanding what that's going to do in our environment. Then go explain to people this consent phishing and how the end user consent framework works and the admin consent framework works, because people don't typically understand that. Now, we don't want to scare you that like this consent phishing is a humongous problem that everyone's getting hit with and we should go stop everything we're doing and take care of this. That's not the case. The most common attacks we see are password spray, where people have an easily guessable password using legacy authentication protocols. People have reused their password. Like that stuff is still the most common. The traditional phishing are the most common things that we see still from an identity attack perspective. But this is something that's emerging. If we want to make sure people are aware of this And we want to make sure those incident response plans we have take this into account, because it's not just as easy as just deleting the application. You got to go look to see what it did and what types of permissions it had in our environment. Then we want to make sure we go ahead and educate our developers on the best practices around using least privilege. So we have some links for you there. And here, I'll paste this right now in the chat. Here is a link to all of the slides that Michael and I just covered today. And then lastly, here we have some other resources for you that we couldn't talk about, we just ran out of time, right? Because we could do a whole day on identity. There's lots and lots of good stuff here, but here is the consent framework. Here's how you can investigate consent grants manually. We have some links to some security steps here. So lots of good stuff here that we're just putting here in the resources that you guys can take a look at after the talk. And with that, we have about, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes left for any questions. We've been trying to keep an eye on the chat as we go, but we'll be watching Discord. This is me on Twitter. I'm at Mark Morrow. Michael Epping, there's someone impersonating him, so he's _ Michael Epping. We can fix that. Okay, so the link requires a login. Let me fix that real quick while, Michael, if you're able to watch any of the questions that come in. Let me fix that right now.
The one question I see is there a way to implement a review process where an admin tier 2 engineer will review and a configuration manager to approve? Which I think is a good question. So if I'm reading the question correctly, I think what you would want is for the engineer to review the permissions and then make recommendations. So your tier 2 engineers, like if they have help desk permissions or things like that, they should be able to run the script. They won't have permissions to go like admin consent to things or revoke permissions, but they can execute the script and review what is in it. So nothing's stopping you from implementing a process where like your tier 2 engineers might run the script, do some analysis. You can delegate permissions to them, like view permissions to them in MCAS if you're using MCAS as your CASB solution. So you can do things like that to give them the ability to investigate and then make recommendations to someone who's got the higher powers to go actually make modifications.
All right, I just updated that link, so hopefully now you can get to the slide deck. Maybe give it another minute or two, but you should be all set. Let me check Discord here. No questions over there.
Yep, I haven't seen any other questions.
If someone can give us an ACK that the link works now, when you try it, that'll be helpful. It should be good. Okay, works for them. Okay, cool.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, Michael and Mark. That was a great talk.